millions of Americans by just hitting a send button. It will also be an agency where millions of Americans have the capacity to communicate with the agency by hitting a send button. And the possibilities here are endless. The notion that part of how one comes to understand and define the problems in the credit area will change if we hear, if this agency hears, if this bureau hears from people who are experiencing it. This is part of it can be built into the research function of the agency. If the agency can hear from people and communicate with people, it changes the concept of how regulations work, of how regulations are tested, of how regulations are communicated, and how they are enforced. So I think of this as a real opportunity as we build this agency, not to replicate what was built last time when we had a consumer agency in the 1970s, but to try a whole new model, to think about this agency from a different perspective. So that's why I came here today. I bought a plane ticket and showed up here because I have a specific ask. I wanted to talk to people who have a voice, and that's why I came to talk to you. There are three things I want to ask you to do with your voice. I want to ask you to use your voice on behalf of economic security for middle-class Americans. In a world in which so many people face so much insecurity, I want you to give them voice. I also want to ask you to use your voice for ideas. This is the place to let ideas be born, to let them bounce around, to let them get tougher, to let the bad ones die out and the good ones advance. This is where ideas should come from. And the third, so I want to ask you to use your voice as a voice of conscience in a world that sorely needs more conscience. You are our collective conversation on conscience. So I'm going to wrap this up by saying we have an opportunity now to pick up the tools that were laid out in this new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And look, unused tools don't do anyone any good. The point is to pick them up and use them, and it's going to be tough. The era of my grandmother in the Great Depression, it was tough then. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt faced his economic royalists. Remember, it took him years to get his entire economic package into place. It paid off. It was tough, but it paid off. So what I want to think about is what we do from this moment going forward. If you have any doubts about where we're headed and how much change we can make, I ask you for just 1 second to glance back over your shoulder at where we have traveled over the last year. I was in Chairman Barney Frank's office just a few weeks ago, and Barney Frank deserves as much credit as anyone on this planet for keeping this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and making it strong. So Chairman Frank and I were talking about some details about the Bureau and what might happen and not in conference. And we got to the end, and Barney looked up in that way he does, you know, over the top of his glasses. And he growled, because that's the only way I know to describe a conversation with Barney. He said, "You know, Elizabeth, a year ago, this idea wouldn't have even qualified as a pipe dream. And here we are." And here's the best part of it when you're thinking about what we can do. We're not here today because the banks gave it to us. The banks did not, a year ago, say, "Well, we're really sorry we broke the economy. And we really appreciate that you put $700 billion and a few trillion in guarantees on the table to help bail us out. And therefore, we're going to support some regulation for ordinary families to kind of level the playing field and just make sure that everybody's getting a fair deal here, that you can read your credit card contracts and mortgage agreements. They didn't say that. They fought us every single inch of the way. They announced in August of last year that the consumer agency was dead. And why was it dead? Because they were going to kill it. They were quoted in the New York Times. They were that sure of themselves. The lobbyists came out and said, we will kill the consumer agency. And they announced it, and they re-announced it, and they re-announced it. They also announced its death over and over and over. If you check the papers, the agency was still dead as of February of this year. But we didn't give up. We scratched and we bit and we hung on and we didn't give up. And today, here's where we are, with a good, strong set of tools to change the consumer market. So let me wrap this back around. Is this going to save the middle class by itself, the consumer agency? I've written about the middle class now for 2 decades. And if you want to give me another couple of hours, I could binge your ear about all that's happened here. And the answer is no. There's frankly too much that's broken. We've got to have change in labor policy. We've got to have change in health policy. We've got to have changes in education policy. That's what it will take to restore a middle class. But we also have to have changes in consumer credit policy. And the new bill is a big step in that direction. So here's what I want to say. One way or another, I'll keep pushing for the middle class. I hope you will too. Thank you. Thank you.
Harvard Law professor Elizabeth Warren, chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel that oversees the bank bailout, and outspoken consumer advocate. She was speaking at the Netroots Nation conference. That does it for today's program.